The story of King Hezekiah is a notable example of God's intervention in the affairs of his people, standing out among the kings of Judah for his faithfulness to God, in contrast to his father, King Ahaz. Hezekiah began to reign at the age of 25 and reigned for 29 years in Jerusalem, being praised for doing what was right in the eyes of the Lord, just like King David. He destroyed the altars of idolatry, cut down sacred poles, and destroyed the bronze serpent made by Moses, which had become an object of worship. During his reign, Hezekiah faced many challenges, including the siege of the cities of Judah by King Sennacherib of Assyria, who conquered all the fortified cities except Jerusalem. To prevent his people from suffering the same fate as Israel, Hezekiah initially sought to appease the Assyrian king by sending gold and silver, even taken from the temple, as tribute. However, Sennacherib continued his campaign against Jerusalem, sending a large army to demand the city's surrender. The Assyrian spokesman, in an attempt to demoralize Hezekiah and the people of Jerusalem, made threats and questioned their trust in God, stating that none of the gods of the other nations had managed to free their people from the hands of the Assyrians. He offered peace and prosperity in exchange for surrender, promising to take them to a land similar to that of Judah. The threats were made in Hebrew so that everyone in the city would understand them, further increasing the panic. Faced with the crisis, Hezekiah sought help from the prophet Isaiah. The prophet brought a message from God, assuring that Sennacherib would return to his land and that Jerusalem would not be handed over to the Assyrians. Isaiah said that God had heard the insulting words of the Assyrian king and would act in defense of his people. Hezekiah, in turn, sought God with fervent prayer, recognizing his sovereignty and pleading for the liberation of Jerusalem, so that all the kingdoms of the earth would know that only the Lord is God. Hezekiah was reminded that Sennacherib's victories were part of God's plan, and that he could accomplish nothing without divine knowledge and permission. God promised that he would defend Jerusalem for the sake of himself and for the sake of his servant David, fulfilling his promise to protect the city and the Davidic lineage, which would culminate in Jesus Christ. The conflict between Hezekiah and the Assyrian Empire is one of the most dramatic and intense episodes in the history of Judah. During Hezekiah's reign, the Assyrian Empire, led by Sennacherib, expanded rapidly, conquering nations and fortified cities. In 701 BC, Sennacherib turned his attention to Judah, capturing several fortified cities and threatening the capital, Jerusalem. The siege of Sennacherib marked the culmination of this threat, testing Hezekiah's faith and leadership. Initially, Hezekiah tried to appease the aggressor with a heavy tribute, offering gold and silver taken from the royal treasury and even from the temple of God. This attempt, however, did not deter Sennacherib, who demanded the complete surrender of Jerusalem. 2 Kings 18 verses 14 to 16. The siege brought panic and despair to the people of Jerusalem, and the words of defiance from the Assyrian spokesman, Rabshakeh, served to increase the climate of fear. He spoke in Hebrew to the soldiers and citizens of Jerusalem, arguing that trusting King Hezekiah or the God of Israel himself would be futile, as no god of the other nations had been able to save his people from the Assyrians. Faced with the threat, Hezekiah resorted to prayer and sought guidance from the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah brought a message of encouragement and promise of deliverance, assuring that God himself would intervene to save Jerusalem. He prophesied that Sennacherib would return to his land without entering the city, and that the Lord would defend Jerusalem out of love for himself and in respect for the promise made to David. Divine intervention was dramatic and decisive. That night, the angel of the Lord passed through the Assyrian camp, killing 185,000 soldiers. Sennacherib, humiliated and defeated, returned to Nineveh, where he was later murdered by his own sons while worshiping in his God's temple. This event marked not only a victory for Hezekiah, but also a powerful demonstration of God's power and faithfulness in protecting his people against seemingly invincible forces. The conflict with the Assyrian Empire reinforced Hezekiah and Judah's faith in divine protection, reminding them that even in the face of the greatest threats, trusting in the Lord was the only answer. The victory over Sennacherib became a symbol of God's sovereignty over the nations and proof that he keeps his promises. Sennacherib, the powerful king of Assyria, represented one of the greatest challenges to Hezekiah's reign and the nation of Judah. In 701 BC, Assyria was the most feared empire in the region, known for its brutality and military effectiveness. Sennacherib, determined to expand his rule and punish the rebels, launched a relentless military campaign against Judah after having already subjugated other important nations and cities. Sennacherib's strategy involved not only brute force, but also sophisticated psychological tactics to undermine the morale of his adversaries. After capturing the fortified cities of Judah, including Lachish, one of the most important fortresses in the region, the Assyrian army approached Jerusalem, surrounding the city. In a move calculated to instill fear, Sennacherib sent his commander, Rabshakeh, to negotiate directly with Hezekiah's representatives and, at the same time, launch a campaign of demoralization against the defenders of Jerusalem. Rabshakeh addressed the people of Jerusalem in Hebrew to ensure that his words were clearly understood by all. He questioned Hezekiah's trust in God and the alliance with Egypt, describing these choices as illusory and insufficient in the face of Assyrian power. Rabshakeh mocked Judah's ability to defend itself and ridiculed the idea that the God of Israel could deliver Jerusalem, citing the gods of other nations that had already been defeated by the Assyrians. In addition to war propaganda, Sennacherib's pressure included a seemingly generous surrender offer. If the inhabitants of Jerusalem surrendered, they would receive fertile land and peace, before being relocated to a new land under Assyrian control. This offer aimed to divide the people's loyalty towards Hezekiah, presenting surrender as a rational and safe choice, contrasting with resistance which, according to Rabshakeh, would lead to certain destruction. Faced with these challenges, Hezekiah faced a leadership crisis. He was surrounded by advisors who feared the overwhelming power of Assyria, and the people were terrified by the possibility of starvation and death. The psychological pressure imposed by Sennacherib was an extreme test of Hezekiah's faith and courage. In an act of desperation and faith, Hezekiah tore his clothes, covered himself in sackcloth, and entered the temple to pray, sending emissaries to Isaiah, the prophet, seeking divine guidance and help. Isaiah's response was a message of hope and trust in God, stating that Sennacherib would not enter Jerusalem, and that the Lord himself would put a spirit in Sennacherib that would cause him to return to his land. This confrontation with Assyria, more than a military clash, became a test of faith and proof of God's sovereignty over the nations and their rulers, reaffirming that, despite Sennacherib's threats and pressure, Judah's destiny was in the balance, in the hands of the Lord. Faced with the imminent threat of the powerful Assyrian army led by Sennacherib, Hezekiah demonstrated remarkable leadership and deep faith. Upon receiving the intimidating message from Rabshakeh, the Assyrian commander, who mocked his trust in God and his alliances, Hezekiah reacted differently than expected by a monarch under attack. He did not give in to despair nor seek last-minute military alliances, but he turned to the Lord in an act of humility and supplication. Hezekiah tore his clothes and covered himself with sackcloth, a symbol of mourning and repentance, expressing his deep anguish and dependence on God. This gesture demonstrated not only his personal distress, but also the call on the entire nation to recognize its impotence in the face of such an overwhelming crisis. He did not trust his own strength nor the city's defenses. His first reaction was to head to the temple of the Lord, showing that his greatest weapon against the Assyrian siege was prayer and the search for divine guidance. Aware of the gravity of the situation, Hezekiah sent emissaries to the prophet Isaiah, one of the most respected men of God of his time. Hezekiah's messengers, including the chief priests and leaders, reported to Isaiah the humiliation and danger Judah faced, describing the time as a day of anguish, a rebuke, and a blasphemy. They asked Isaiah to intercede with the Lord on behalf of the remnant of Judah, so that God would hear Sennacherib's insults and act in defense of his people. Isaiah's response was a word of comfort and reassurance. He assured Hezekiah that God had heard Sennacherib's blasphemies against him and that, therefore, the king of Assyria would not prevail. Isaiah prophesied that God would send a spirit of confusion upon Sennacherib, causing him to return to his land, where he would be defeated. This prophecy offered Hezekiah renewed hope and assurance that God was in control, even when the situation seemed humanly hopeless. Hezekiah, faced with these words from Isaiah, grew stronger and persisted in his stance of dependence on the Lord. He continued to seek God in fervent prayer, recognizing divine sovereignty over all nations. At a decisive moment, Hezekiah presented Sennacherib's threatening letter before the Lord, crying out for help and glorifying God's power over all the kingdoms of the earth. His prayer was an act of total surrender, where Hezekiah declared his faith in the living God, asking him to show his greatness, not only to save Jerusalem, but so that all people would know that the Lord is God. The divine response was powerful and immediate. That same night, the angel of the Lord went out and struck down 185,000 soldiers of the Assyrian army, forcing Sennacherib to retreat to Nineveh, where he was later murdered by his own sons. This miraculous victory not only freed Jerusalem, but also reaffirmed Judah's faith in God's power and protection, demonstrating that trust in God is more powerful than any human strength. Divine intervention in the confrontation between Judah and the Assyrian Empire was marked by one of the most notable episodes in the Old Testament, where Isaiah's prophecy was fulfilled in an extraordinary way, revealing the power of God and his faithfulness towards his people. Faced with the overwhelming threat of Sennacherib, who challenged not only Hezekiah's kingdom, but the God of Israel himself, the Lord's response was decisive and overwhelming, transforming the course of events in an unexpected way. After Hezekiah received Sennacherib's intimidating message, in which the Assyrian king blasphemed the God of Israel, the prophet Isaiah conveyed a word of hope that would come to fruition in an impressive way. Isaiah declared that Sennacherib would not enter Jerusalem, would not even shoot an arrow against the city, and that he would return the way he came, as the Lord himself would drive him away. This prophecy was a guarantee of divine protection that defied all military logic at the time, since the Assyrian army was vast and experienced. The night after the prophecy, one of the most impactful miracles in biblical history occurred. Divine intervention was direct and relentless. The angel of the Lord passed through the Assyrian camp and killed 185,000 soldiers in a single night. This unexpected and supernatural action completely dismantled Sennacherib's army, forcing him to retreat to Nineveh in defeat. The magnitude of the destruction was such that the powerful king of Assyria, who until then seemed invincible, was forced to abandon his military campaign against Judah without having fired a single siege shot at Jerusalem. This intervention not only saved Jerusalem from destruction, but also served as a clear testimony to God's power over the greatest empires on earth. It was proof that, even in the face of the most formidable threats, the Lord could turn any situation around in favor of his people. Isaiah's prophecy was fully fulfilled, demonstrating that the prophet's words were true and inspired by God himself. The result was a great humiliation for the Assyrian king, who saw his forces defeated without Judah having to lift a sword. In addition to the immediate impact on the battlefield, the event strengthened the faith of the people of Judah and cemented Isaiah's reputation as a true spokesman for God. The prophecy and its miraculous fulfillment showed that God's word does not fail, and that he is a safe refuge in times of adversity. Hezekiah, who had placed all his trust in the Lord, saw his faith rewarded in an impressive way, solidifying the understanding that divine protection is sovereign over any human power. Sennacherib's defeat was followed by a tragic end for the Assyrian king. Upon returning to Nineveh, he was murdered by his own sons while worshiping in the temple of their god Nisroch. This outcome not only fulfilled Isaiah's word about Sennacherib's return to his land, but also symbolized the total defeat of anyone who dared to challenge the God of Israel. This episode became a powerful reminder that God defends his glory and protects those who trust in him, elevating the story of Hezekiah and Isaiah as a landmark of faith and trust in divine providence. The outcome of the crisis between Judah and the Assyrian Empire marked a crucial point in the history of Israel, highlighting God's sovereignty and the importance of faith and obedience to his guidelines. After the miracle that decimated Sennacherib's army, Hezekiah and his kingdom were spared imminent destruction, and Jerusalem remained intact, a feat that seemed impossible given the threat of one of the most powerful empires of the time. The unexpected victory reinforced the belief that God's protection was decisive, even against enemies who, in human eyes, were invincible. The exact fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy not only confirmed the prophet's legitimacy as a divine messenger, but also served as a powerful testimony to the surrounding nations. The defeat of the Assyrian army without any human military intervention was an unequivocal demonstration that God's power is not limited by the strengths and strategies of men. Sennacherib's end was equally revealing of divine justice. After returning to Nineveh, humiliated and without conquering Jerusalem, he faced a dark fate. He was murdered by two of his sons while worshiping their god, Nisroch. This violent and dishonorable death sealed the fate of a leader who had directly defied the Lord of Israel. This tragic end reinforced the message that no arrogance against God goes unpunished, and that, regardless of human power, it is the Lord who decides the course of history. The conclusion of this chapter reinforces several lasting lessons for the Jewish and Christian faith. Firstly, it highlights the importance of total trust in God in the face of adversity. Hezekiah, by seeking help from Isaiah and praying fervently, demonstrated that dependence on God is the key to true security. Second, it reveals that the words of the prophets are vehicles of divine will, and that even when circumstances seem discouraging, God's intervention can completely transform the situation. Furthermore, the divine victory over Sennacherib symbolizes the Lord's protection over his people, even when surrounded by powerful enemies. The preservation of Jerusalem not only safeguarded the lineage of David, from which the Messiah would come, but also reaffirmed God's promise to defend those who are faithful to him. Hezekiah's trust in God's powerful action served to strengthen the faith of the people of Judah, leaving a spiritual legacy that resonated for generations. Finally, this episode illustrates that true security does not come from political alliances or military strength, but from faithfulness to God and obedience to his word. The story of Hezekiah, Sennacherib, and Isaiah is a continual reminder that, in the face of the most daunting challenges, divine intervention is capable of altering the destinies of nations and kingdoms, reaffirming that God is always in control and that is what prevails over all things.